In the last video, we saw that my biological age, when using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, was about 17 years younger than my chronological. So what may be contributing to these data? So let's start off with supplements. And if you're familiar with the channel, the first two shouldn't be a surprise. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my early 20s, so I've been taking prescription levothyroxine since then, 137.5 micrograms per day. And then in the non-summer months, so 8 to 9 months out of the year, I supplement with 1,000 IUs of vitamin D. And you can see that for all 49 days that correspond to this test, I supplemented with vitamin D. So more about that 49-day period. So that it started on the day after the last blood test, which was on November 27th of 2023, and lasted until the day before this blood test, which was January 14th of 2024. So from the immediately after the last blood test to the day before this blood test is a 49-day period. I also supplemented with methylfolate, 400 micrograms per day, but only 18 of the 49 days that correspond to this blood test, as I added other stuff into the diet that has folate, so I thought it would be wise to take out the supplement. And I also supplemented with methyl B12, 1,000 micrograms per day for all 49 days of this period, because that's significantly correlated with lower homocysteine in my data. I also supplemented with nicotinic acid, but only for 2 of the 49 days in this period, in part because I don't want to supplement with it all the time, knowing that it could impact the epigenetic pace of aging, otherwise known as Dunedin pace. But I think that there may be some value in supplementing with it on exercise days, as that may be when I need the biggest NAD boost or the biggest effect of NAD restoration by including some nicotinic acid. Now, interestingly, I also discovered in my data that a relatively higher niacin intake, including supplemental nicotinic acid, is significantly associated with a higher heart rate variability and a lower resting heart rate, which is good news because that's closer to youthful status. And that's after adjusting for body weight. And I posted that data on Patreon. I may include that in a video at some point in the future. And that's it for supplements. No other purported geroprotectors or senolytics, which then brings us to diet. And more specifically, what diet composition corresponds to blood test number 1 in 2024. And that's what we'll see here. We're going to see the average daily dietary intake for the 49-day period that corresponded to this blood test. And note that I track all of my daily diet by weighing it first on a food scale, entering it into Chronometer, and then manually entering all of that data into an Excel spreadsheet where I can then line up each blood test with a corresponding average dietary intake. In terms of the foods that I ate for this 49-day period, the average daily dietary intake, we can see the top 25 foods here that are ranked in terms of grams, with the exception of green tea, which is in ounces. And if you want to use what I use as a quick shout out, there's a discount link for the company that I use. It's organic loose leaf green tea sourced from Japan. So check that out in the video's description if you want to use what I use. All right, so were there any experiments for this test? And if you're familiar with the channel, you'll know that my strawberry intake is usually around 600 grams per day. So I purposely cut that by about 150 grams. And I'll get to that why in a second. But I also cut yogurt because some of the strawberries I mix with yogurt is kind of like an ice cream. So if I'm cutting strawberries, I also cut the yogurt out. So I did that to get some calories to spend on other stuff, to do a couple of experiments. And one of those was the inclusion of oranges. So why oranges? Oranges are a rich source of proline betaine, 510 micrograms per gram, and that paper will be in the video's description. All of the papers will be in the video's description that are referenced in this video. So what is proline betaine? So we can see its structure there. So the amino acid protein at its nitrogen atom, you can see that there are 2 methyl groups. So in other words, proline betaine is dimethylproline. In other words, it can act potentially as a methyl donor for reducing homocysteine or potentially impacting methylation, whether it's the Horvath epigenetic test or Dunedin pace. At least that's the goal. So from oranges, based on the 63 grams per day average that I took in, and when multiplying that by 510 micrograms per gram of oranges, that yields 32 milligrams per day of proline betaine. In other words, expanding my methyl donor pool. And I know everybody or a lot of people talk about trimethylglycine, which under the same structural context is 3 methyl groups added to the nitrogen of the amino acid glycine. In my case, trimethylglycine doesn't make a dent on homocysteine. In the past, I've tried up to 3 grams per day, no effect. So it may be possible that I'm saturated on how much trimethylglycine I'm already eating because beets are a rich source. And I need to expand the methyl donor pool by adding other amino acids that are either di or trimethylated. For example, Another one is tryptophan betaine. In other words, trimethyltryptophan. So I'll have more on that in an upcoming video. So did adding oranges and their proline betaine intake make a dent on homocysteine? So homocysteine for this test, on the January 15 test, was 9.6 micromolar, which there's room for improvement there. But the previous 15 test average was 10.5 micromolar. So moving in the right direction, or just some random variability where it's lower than average. Nonetheless, it's going in the right direction, as I'd want to see it closer to my youthful values, somewhere around 5 to 6 micromolar. All right, I also added chickpeas into the diet, and not so much because of the recent video where I showed that legume fiber is associated, or 5 grams of legume fiber is associated with a lower risk of all-cause mortality, but because chickpeas are a rich source of trigonelline, also known as 1-methylnicotinate. So 1-methylnicotinate has a methyl group that, when trigonelline is converted into nicotinic acid, can act as a methyl donor, again, potentially impacting homocysteine and other methylation-related pathways, thereby increasing my methyl donor pool. Now, whether that actually is what can happen, we'll see. I'm waiting on epigenetic data. But for the homocysteine data, when considering the inclusion of chickpeas and oranges, that it's going in the right direction, I may be onto something. So was there an impact on NAD, as the goal of adding chickpeas was to increase trigonelline, which can potentially increase NAD, and that data will be in the next video. All right, on to part 2 of the diet. We can see that I consumed 48 different foods for this test, and the same system ranked in terms of grams from 26 to 48. Now, also to get chickpeas into the diet, I cut other foods that contributed calories, as the goal is to not increase calorie intake, but to stay eukcaloric or a little bit less. And to do that, I cut oats and barley intake. They're usually around 25 to 30 grams per day. So in total, I cut the two of them together by about 50 grams per day to get chickpeas into the diet. Now, the diet isn't purposefully always clean. I do include cheat meals, but at most, I try to limit that to 2 per dietary period, or 2 per 49-day period. For this test, it was chocolate chips mixed with sweetened condensed milk and peanut butter. I love homemade Reese's peanut butter cups, and I usually make it with chocolate chips, melting the chocolate chips and adding that to peanut butter. So for this test, I decided to sweeten it up with literally sweetened condensed milk, which was pretty tasty too. For the most recent test, though, I used honey, so we'll see that in an upcoming video sometime in March. Now, in terms of calories, what this relatively lower nutritious food, chocolate chips and sweetened condensed milk, added to the diet: 551 calories from the chocolate chips, 476 calories from the sweetened condensed milk. And again, that's over 2 different days. That's not a small amount every day for 49 days, but 2 days where I had it, and then 47 days I didn't have it at all. No junk for 47 days. So in terms of percentage of the diet that's clean, 99% clean, 1% a little bit of junk. That's what works for me. Other stuff may work for other people. I let the biomarkers drive how often to have cheat meals in the approach. And if I go more than that, now I start to run the risk of obsessing about junk food and potentially going off diet and messing up the biomarkers, so I'm not trying to do that. 2 cheat meals seems to work well for me. It may not be like that for others, but that's how it goes for me. All right, so this list is ranked in grams. What about foods ranked in terms of calories? And that's what we'll see here: top 10 foods for average daily calorie intake for the 49-day period that corresponded to blood test number 1 in 2024. And we can see that here. And note that these data are tracked with Chronometer. If you want to track your own diet using Chronometer, there's a discount link in the video's description. So in terms of the food that contributed the most in terms of daily calories, it's sardines. And then just quickly going through the list: strawberries, chickpeas, flax seeds, almonds, carrots, coconut butter, collard greens, beets, and pistachios round out for where I'm getting the majority of my daily calories. Which then brings us to macronutrient composition. So first, starting with calorie intake, average daily calorie intake, it was 2092 calories per day, which, if you're familiar with the channel, you've heard me say this many, many times, but this is, again, my lowest calorie intake, average daily calorie intake, since I started tracking diet in April of 2015. The previous low was 2106, and that was for test number 7 in 2023. And for those who may be new, I've been slowly making very small cuts to the average daily calorie intake, as it's easier for me to maintain that weight loss, that fat loss, over a long period of time, relative to in the past where I've made very big cuts to calorie intake and got lean really quickly, but wasn't able to maintain it and literally binged that weight back on. So small cuts over a long period of time have enabled me to stay leaner for longer and not feel like I'm missing anything in the diet while still being satiated. Average daily protein intake for this test was 97 grams per day. In terms of percentage of calories in the diet, it was 18.6% of total calories. What about fat intake? We can see that here. Average daily fat intake was 81.2 grams per day, which is about 35% of total calories. Now, something else that I'd like to highlight is when considering that my biological age data is consistently in the 15 to 17 years younger than my chronological age, I'm not trying to blow up the system from test to test. I'm trying to maintain that for every test. And one way that I do that is by trying to ensure that my macros are consistent for every test. And we can see that by looking at the data for fat intake for the November 27th test, which was test number 7 in 2023. And without going through each individual fat, you can see that the data is remarkably consistent. And that's done on purpose. That's not by accident. I aim to have consistency across the diet, whether it's protein intake, fat intake, including monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, etc., from test to test, with the goal of having my data, my biomarker data, be consistent also from test to test. All right, next up is carb intake. So total carbs were about 283 grams per day, which seems like a lot, but net carbs equals total carbs minus fiber. Average daily fiber intake for this test was about 86 grams per day. So when subtracting that from total carbs, we get a net carbs of about 197 grams per day. When multiplying that by 4 calories per gram, that yields a net carbs of about 38% of total calories. Now note that fiber also contributes calories to the diet, around 2 calories per gram, and that's because the soluble fiber fraction of fiber is converted into short-chain fatty acids. In other words, a small percentage of fiber is converted into fats. And with that in mind, 185 calories from fiber, which is about 9% of my diet or 9% of my total calories, can be added to total fat, such that now we can calculate my net macros that correspond to this test. My average daily net macros for that 49-day period of about 44% total fat, 38% net carbs, and 18.6% total protein. Now note that within sugars, I don't look at correlations for total sugars with biomarkers, but I do look at correlations for total fructose, as the diet has a lot of fructose-containing foods, and in my data, for whatever reason, relatively higher fructose intake is significantly correlated with a lot more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So I try to limit how much fructose that I take in while not completely eliminating it, as it'll probably be virtually impossible because the foods that include it impacts how satiated that I am. Nonetheless, total fructose for this test, we can see that by adding fructose plus half of sucrose, as sucrose is half fructose. And when adding those two together, we get a total fructose average daily intake of about 61 grams per day for this test. Now, for comparison, that's close to my lowest fructose intake since starting diet tracking in 2015, which is 57.5 grams per day. Now, I know that that still may seem like a lot, but this is relatively half of my highest intake since I started tracking diet in 2015. So progress, not perfection. All right, what about micronutrients? What do they look like in terms of how they correspond to this test for the 49-day period in average for this test? And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I just want to put it up so people see that data. So all of the vitamins posted there, I'd encourage going full screen if you haven't already, because they're very small and it may be hard to see if you're not on full screen. And then mineral intake. And what I'd like to highlight here for those who are interested in looking at the micronutrients is that I have full RDA coverage. That's essential, I think, to starting this process, is making sure you're at least covering the RDA. But many micronutrients are purposely much higher than the RDA, and that's because I'm following their correlations with multiple blood biomarkers and a few other biomarkers too, like slow wave sleep and blood pressure. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon. And before you go, we've got a whole bunch of discount links and merch that you may be interested in, including discount links for epigenetic testing, NAD quantification, oral microbiome composition, at-home metabolomics, at-home blood testing with SciFox Health, which includes ApoB and a different panel from the at-home metabolomics, diet tracking with Chronometer, green tea, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, so if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Dietary brand, as I've got on here, and as I wear all the time, that link and all the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.